among other projects, and you were doing lots of stuff, you get involved in some very heady questions about the origins of truth on the internet. And this is where we're getting, folks, because the work that Danny is describing now in theory ultimately became a venture, right? MetaWeb.
Yep. So that's right. So what I really thought is that what we need to do is have a way of representing the knowledge of the world in a way that machines can get at them and take advantage of it. And that should be shared. Everybody should be able to get at it. That's in some sense, if the human knowledge isn't a shared resource, then what is? I mean, what has civilization been doing all these years? So I created a company that built this database called Freebase. It was a free database.
No comment.
And the company basically took any kind of public knowledge that we could get, information about anything, and put it in a machine-readable format. We were kind of creating it with the idea that this is going to be useful to the world. We didn't really have a business model. And we started building it up, and then it became useful to lots of different people, including, in particular, all the search engines.
Dun, dun, dun.
So eventually Google bought it, of course. And then I got Google to agree to keep it open for 3 years, but they only kept the part that was already open, and they started building it up. And so now the Google has something called the knowledge graph, which is the evolution of this. And it probably has about 100 billion different entities. So everybody in this room is in that graph. This building is in that graph.
Yeah, I took a screenshot earlier of when you just Google Neue House and all of these different...
Yeah, that's right. Neue House,
including
obviously
this
in
event.
Which so, this event is, and so anything like a person, a place, an event, anything like that is in this huge knowledge base, and all the relationships between them are. So when you, for instance, print out a Google map, that is rendered from the knowledge graph. So the knowledge graph knows the bus schedules, and it knows, the address of the restaurant and the traffic.
Drawing all this information together around the thing that the searcher cares about.
That's right. So the map is just, in some sense, a custom rendering of a piece of the knowledge graph for your particular purpose. And also, by the way, I don't know, this doesn't have any ads on it, but the other thing is that the ads are also like a lot of knowledge graph about what the products are about, and whether it probably has knowledge about you specifically and so on. So it's gone way beyond the kind of public knowledge. It's also beginning to probably have very particular private knowledge about people too.
Now, from Google's perspective, it's safe to say that this is a quantum leap in terms of the original basis of its sort of citation-based search model. All of a sudden, it is now providing this multi-dimensional search that is drawing in way more richness.
Yeah, so that it still does the old kind of search. So right now, let's say I put in museums of New York, museums in New York. Well, it still does the old keyword search of searching for pages that have the word museum and the phrase New York. But it doesn't, if you say, an exhibition in Manhattan or something, you might have something that's a museum in New York that actually didn't use the word museum in New York on the page. But the knowledge graph knows that Manhattan is in New York, and it knows that exhibitions are museums, or it may know something is a museum even if it doesn't use the word museum in its title. And so it's actually able to pick that up even though doesn't have the keyword. So that will play into the search results that come up. It does a search that's based on the semantics. And of course that's very important because that kind of knowledge is completely language independent too. So the same knowledge that informs your search in English also informs somebody's search in Mandarin or Hindi or something like that. So but the bad news is, so the good news is, it's turned out to be really useful. There are these big representations of knowledge. But the bad news is the whole idea of it being this free, open thing that everybody was going to use has actually become really just something that is a competitive advantage of Google, and now, other search engines and other companies will make their own. I'm sure Apple's working on it, Amazon, each of the big companies, IBM, Microsoft, they'll each work on their own database. But I think, so the world could go in one of two directions. We could either have this sort of oligarchy of big companies that have their giant, knowledge bases that they use for proprietary advantage, or it could flip over and say, it becomes a public resource, that we could say, we want knowledge to be a public resource. And we want, in particular, knowledge that's tied to who said what, because this is doesn't represent truth, remember, it represents who said stuff. And that becomes then a resource for doing things like sorting out what's fake news, or deciding what medical treatments, what effects are in the scientific literature, things like that really don't align very well with commercial.
Right. And this is where Underlay comes in. Underlay, in many respects, is your attempt to kind of reclaim this technology as the public good that you initially envisioned it as.
Yeah, it's my penance for having sold the other one to Google.
Well, so I've actually stuck on the screen here. I thought there was a very nice paragraph on the very simple Underlay website, which basically, in written terms, explains kind of what it's attempting to do. And it says, the Underlay aggregates statements and reported observations along with citations of who made them and who published them. For example, it would not contain the bare assertion that Sudan's population was 39 million in 2008, but rather that Sudan's population was provisionally 39 million in 2008, according to the UN Statistics Division in 2011, referencing Sudan's national census as reported by its Central Bureau of Statistics and as contested by the Southern People's Liberation Movement.
Yeah, and it would do that not in those words, but in a kind of machine-readable.
Right, so that those could be, and ultimately this is, this version of what you were going at becomes almost a kind of record of all of these observations over time, and it can be tracked. So if we wanted to get to the heart of, let's say, whether in one of these hearings we've just watched, somebody said what or the other, we could trace it potentially back to the first recorded instance.
Yeah, and if you take a problem like that, I would regard that as an application of the Underlay, just like Google Maps as drawing a map is. But if you take sorting through fake news and recognizing when rumors are getting out of control, in order to do that, you really need a very complex representation of who's saying what. So you can kind of trace, well, this person said that, or this person said that this person said that, or the New York Times said that, the Drudge Report said that, and so there is something that needs to be built on top of the Underlay that is essentially a network of trust for that purpose. So somebody has to say, well, okay, I trust the New York Times more than I trust Fox News, or vice versa, or and
these would be organizations or individuals with some sort of framework of analysis that would leverage the Underlay and for interpretive purposes.
And it's going to be for different purposes. I mean, and that's an awful lot of the things that people argue about. I mean, is Taiwan a province of China? Well, if you're doing something with the Chinese government, you've got to count it as one. If you're doing something with Taiwan, you're probably not going to count it. So for some purposes it is, for some purposes it isn't. And so there is, what's the truth of that? Well, there isn't exactly the truth. It's, what's the purpose, what's the trust in it, and so on. And many of these, so I sort of feel like the Underlay is, in some sense, is a piece of the plumbing that we need to deal with the fact that the amount of information has become overwhelming, that no human can hold it all in their heads. Nobody can be sort of familiar with all the news sources or things like that. And then that lets us build these things on top of it where computers help us be smarter in sort of navigating these networks of trust.
And so you're conceiving of this challenge, this is in the early aughts, right? And what was the first inklings of an approach that technology could provide to addressing this and to kind of capturing the chain, if you will, of custody of information?
So the idea was to build something that basically said agreed on what the things you were talking about, the entities that you were talking about, let people make statements about the relationships between them, but then have some provenance of who made those statements. So that instead of recording that the glass is sitting on the table, you record Danny said the glass is sitting on the table on such and such a day. Right. And then once you have all that information recorded, then that lets you, first of all, it lets you record the information without worrying too much about whether it's true. It's true that I said that.
Right.
Which is much easier to determine than whether it's true that the glass is actually on the table. But then it also lets you apply basically your idea of trust afterwards, after you get more information about who I am, or later you find out I'm a liar, or later you find out the glass was someplace else.
You can weigh those previous recordings
exactly.
against
Yeah. So it's sort of, the idea is that what we really need to do is we need to separate up two things. We need to separate the record of what different people said and who said it, the provenance of what was said, and then separately have, in some sense, a network of trust, which is going to be different for different purposes. Ultimately, there's lots of kinds of knowledge that I think really are fundamentally part of the public common, the public good. And I hope that those will end up in it. And I think it's not as complicated as copyright law, where you're taking the expression of individual artists and things like that. A fact is a fact. It's not copyrightable. Truth. If somebody figures out that the geographical location of this building, that's just a truth. Nobody owns that. And really, it's to everybody's advantage to share that.